Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. How you doing? I hope everything is going great. I am with you guys today to pose a very interesting question, a question that often I hear when people ask me, "What do you want to specialize as?" And I reply, "I'd like to be a psychiatrist." And then they say, "You are gonna go wacko." And well, I don't know if that is true or not, and that's what I wanted to know. So I went on Google and I did a little search and reading about and read a couple of papers about the effect of psychiatry on psychiatrists and found very interesting things that I'd like to share with you today. So let's think about the question itself. Does psychiatry affect psychiatrists? Well, it would be fair to pose the question, does cardiology affect cardiologists and does surgery affect surgeons and etc., etc.? I think that working in any speciality will affect you in many, many ways. But psychiatry is kind of different because it's not a tangible field. Not really. It is associated with medications. Yes, there is a massive part of psychiatry related to psychopharmacology, but there is a significant part of it that is very intangible. That is just basically you dealing with a human mind, with emotions, with feelings, with all these things that you really can't grasp and can't hold and can't fix and can't suture together the same way that a gynecologist could deliver or a surgeon could excise. So psychiatry is kind of different. Some people even consider it as a pseudoscience or not really a branch of medicine. And that is another topic that I'd like to tackle later on and kind of explore a little further into to what extent is psychiatry actually a field of medicine. But let's not talk about that now. So, as we said, you know, I want to know if I work in the field of psychiatry, if you work in the field of psychiatry or mental health in general, so you work as a psychotherapist or you work as a psychologist, are you going to go crazy? Does it make you go crazy? Or is the question is, do people who already take these fields of specialization already kind of disturbed in the first place? Good question. I mean, let me give you an example of a very, very interesting and well-known guy, Freud, of course. He was known to be a little wacko. One of the strange things that happened to him was at some point when he was in his 40s, he got a new telephone number. And this telephone number, he believed, this telephone number here on the right, the 14362, he believed that was a sign that he was going to die at the age of at the age of 62. And he believed in that so firmly, and he was just so, caught up in that thought. It's almost a delusion. Until, of course, his birthday came and he was 63 and he realized, well, that's not true. So he's been known for strange beliefs. He's been known for frequent blackouts, for agoraphobia and cocaine abuse. And there's many, many examples of other people who work in the field of mental health that are not exactly purely, mentally okay. So let's really talk about that. Let's try to find out to what degree that is true, and maybe the reasons why we might find psychiatrists or people in the mental health field not to be so normal. So let's talk a little bit about some of the theories. And well, this is one that I can completely relate to. They say that people who enter into the field of mental health and mental illness in the first place, so people who want to work as psychiatrists or therapists, they themselves have a history of psychological difficulties, and they propose that going into the field is basically as a way for them to try to understand and overcome their own problems. Wow, I can really relate to that. Since school, I've been in school since I was in year, I don't know, I was a kid. I've always wanted to be a counselor. Why? Because I had difficulties in school, and I've always wanted to be a counselor. It's somehow like a self-healing process. You feel like you're self-healing in a way. And even Freud said something quite cool. He said that childhood loss is the underlying cause of an adult's desire to help others. If you find people who are, always so keen to help and volunteer and give, and do charities and things, he says, apparently according to his psychoanalytic theory, that these people, their underlying motive for that is childhood loss, in whatever form it may be in. And even Anna Freud, who is his daughter, said the most sophisticated defense mechanism I've ever encountered was becoming a psychotherapist. It is somehow that people who are a little bit psychologically disturbed or have had difficulties in their upbringing, in their life, take up or are more attracted to the field of mental health. So in the first place, people who enter may be a little bit, screwed up. According to, in the article I read called Why Shrinks Have Problems, it was an article I found in Psychology Today written by Robert Epstein. Very, very nice article. I will share it with you in the comment section, or rather in the, description thingy down there. It stated that the American Psychiatric Association found that physicians in general, with affect disorders, tend to select psychiatry as a specialty. Affect disorders here means disorders of mood, like depression, like bipolar disorder. And that therapists were found to have a higher level of family dysfunction, parental alcoholism, abuse in the form of physical or sexual abuse, have experienced a particular death at any point, or had psychiatric hospitalizations at some point in their lives. And 2/3 of therapists actually have had history of abuse in their childhoods. It sounds really kind of weird. It's like all the scarred, broken people are the ones who take up psychiatry. And part of it is actually true. And another really, really intriguing theory is the hypothesis or the concept of the wounded healer. And this theory was raised by Carl Jung, who spoke about how a therapist who has himself experienced a psychological difficulty is more drawn to helping people who have experienced the same trauma, and he is more likely to empathize and be able to help heal the client, the patient. Because it's somehow when the therapist listens to the difficulty of the client, there is a sort of counter-transference back to him. And there's this strange, or it's not strange, but there's this psychological magnetism or motive to help the client. It is a really, really beautiful concept, the concept of the wounded healer. However, I don't think, and according to what I've read, it is not a rule. It's not a rule that all psychiatrists should have had psychological trauma or psychological difficulties in order to help people, in order to empathize. You don't need to have to go through, sexual abuse to empathize or to understand or to help a person who's been sexually abused, for example. It's not a rule. However, they found that in the first few sessions with the patient, a therapist who has been traumatized in one way or another can empathize better later on. Okay. Another reason, this is the first reason here, is that basically the person is healing themselves. The therapist is basically healing themselves. The second thing is that working in the mental health field, you are exposed to a lot of shit. Now, it's not really, shit in the meaning of it, but you are exposed to people who are suicidal, people who are depressed, people who are demoralized, people who have had terrible, terrible, terrible stories that have been really, really traumatized in their life. Just listening to that, some sort of carries certain vibes to you. some really interesting statistics is that half of therapists have been threatened by violence at some point, and 40% of therapists have actually been attacked by their patients, physically and verbally attacked. And that is really, it really puts into perspective that psychiatry is not just you sitting there listening to patients, but it's actually quite a hazardous field because you're working with people who are sort of unstable, uninhibited at times. Another situation you can imagine that would affect a therapist is, for example, you're giving psychotherapy to a patient for years and years on end, and you're meeting them a couple of times a week, and then you hear that they've committed suicide. And up to 20 to 30% of therapists have actually experienced a suicide of their patient. I can not imagine how painful that must feel for a therapist to know that the patient that they've been treating has committed suicide. Partly because you've formed a connection with that person, so you feel like you've lost somebody, but also because you are somehow involved in his treatment, and his or her suicide could sort of reflect on you, could reflect on your esteem that you didn't do enough, you didn't help enough, So I think that will definitely affect a therapist greatly. Mental health profession is a hazardous field. It is hazardous. And, I think it takes massive courage. It takes massive patience to be able to sit, and listen to just your next door neighbor complaining about the difficulties in life, let alone if you're working in that professionally. So you're working like 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, for months, years on end, even decades. I think it will have an impact on you some way or another. And the reason I am putting up this topic is that it should raise in us a question when I talk about how bad things can get for a psychiatrist. That the question that should arise is, what can I do about it? Once I enter the field of psychiatry, once I become a psychiatrist, what can I do about it to protect myself from these things? We will discuss that perhaps later on. A third reason why therapists tend to get messed up a little bit is that, frankly, we are human beings too, and life is rough. Life is rough on every one of us, and 3 out of 4 therapists experience distress in any point of their lives. And this is really significant, over 60%, more than 60% of therapists have experienced clinical depression at one point or another. Because you are stressed out at work due to the nature of its work, due to the actual economic, or rather field in which you're working in, especially if you're working in a culture in which psychiatry and mental health is not fully embraced, not fully accepted. A culture such as in the Middle East, people often associate, mental illness with being cursed, with being possessed, with being whatever. And people who work in the mental health field actually are looked down upon, or rather looked at as, strange people who don't really do anything. So it is stressful, and it's stressful to find a good working environment to help your patients. And, a really, really pessimistic statistic that I read here was that they did a study on graduates from the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, psychiatrists, and they found that the divorce rate for a psychiatrist was actually 51%, which is significantly higher than any field in medicine. So out of all the physicians, psychiatrists are the most likely to get divorced. Wow. That's a big deal, I think, and that really reflects that there is issues with or little support for people who work in the mental health field. It is demanding, the field is demanding in itself, and it is, increasingly getting more difficult to make a living. Um, yeah. Now let's talk about suicide among therapists. This is the end result. This is what the worst outcome could be for a therapist in the field of mental health, that they could just commit suicide. And this is not uncommon at all. In fact, 1 in 4 psychologists have had suicidal feelings at one point in their lives, and 16% have actually attempted suicide. And people who work in the mental health field are significantly, or let me not say significantly, let me give you numbers. They are twice more likely to commit suicide than other physicians working in any other field. That could be explained by multiple things, maybe by the things we said, due to them entering the field already disturbed, the high demands of the field, and the stressors that are related to working in this field. So it really, really sounds very sad. It sounds really horrible. It makes you want to say, I don't want to work in this field, man. It's going to be terrible. And despite talking about all that, I think that psychiatry and working in the field of mental health is highly rewarding, highly, highly, highly beautiful, and is very noble. And we will discover a little bit further on why it is so. But there is another question that is often kind of raised, and my friends who know that I want to work in that field often think, because she's a psychiatrist and because she reads up about psychiatry and diseases, she is more likely, or rather less likely, to become depressed or disturbed, because she can deal with that, because she knows all about it, so she can help herself better. And that's a question. Do therapists usually use their own tools? Do they protect themselves from mental illness through their own tools? Actually, some research has been found that therapists in general do say, or do admit, that they experience just as much stress as any lay person. However, they are able to cope better. And an interesting psychologist, a behavioral psychologist called B.F. Skinner, applied his own behavioral principles to himself to change his behavior in a positive direction. And he often looked at psychoanalysts and people like Freud in a very demeaning way, like, you guys didn't use your science to help you. So yeah, that's no good, is it? But we find, and they found that it's not often the same case, because doctors actually themselves, when they are giving advice to their patients, when they're prescribing medication for their patients, they tend to do it in a very sure manner. But when they get to do it for themselves, they tend to be quite pragmatic. They tend to be quite atypical. They don't actually stick to the rules of what should be done. And that really just raises a very important point here. Do psychiatrists get psychiatric help? Should they? Yes, they should. That's for sure. That is very that is recommended. As you can tell, the people who work in this field are subjected to a lot of stress. So naturally, they should get help. And famous psychoanalyst said that a psychiatrist should get up every 5 years at least to go to a psychiatric clinic and get some help. But I think it's not. I think every 5 years is a little too far. There is an interesting thing that happens in my university. It's something called the T group, or the therapists group, in which all the psychiatrists meet every fortnight, and they sit in a circle and they kind of sort of talk about their problems. They kind of express about the troubles that they may be finding, or the challenges, or suggestions, or they provide help and advice to each other. And that, I think, is an absolutely brilliant tool to help psychiatrists to vent, to understand each other, to help each other in a setting that is still kind of inside work, So in summary, I think that people working in the mental health field do have higher risk of developing psychological difficulties, developing depression, developing all sorts of problems, because maybe initially they go in the field already kind of disturbed, and while they're embedded within the field, they become infected, quote unquote, by the vibes, by the difficult working environment, by the possible threats that they face from patients, and from the death of their patients even. So what we do need now for any person who is hoping to enter into this field is to be fully aware that there are dangers of entering into this field, and that there are things they can do to tackle that, things they can do and think about and plan for to help them vent, to help them form a sort of healthy internal environment, to look for and reach out for psychological help and psychological venting from any source. I think that around concludes what I wanted to say. We will discuss other interesting topics in the following weeks, I hope. Thank you for listening, and I'd really like to hear what your views are on this. If you got any input, I would like to hear from it for sure. And yeah, thank you very much. I'll see you soon. Bye.